Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, for a special episode produced in association with Gallagher Specialty. You're listening to an independent podcast focused on geopolitics to serve risk professionals and decision makers across specialty insurance markets, reinsurance and beyond. Our topic is intangible risks, concrete examples, infrastructure and state-sponsored cyber in focus. I'm your host, David Benyon. To talk about this crucial subject, I'm pleased to welcome Sneha Dowda, who's a consultant for crisis and security strategy at Another Day. Now, this is a really vital topic that cuts across cyber risk and its physical aspect, with geopolitical relevance for cyber threats, with critical national infrastructure suddenly on the front line of the new global era of geopolitics that we face. It's a major front in the so-called grey zone tactics that governments and government-linked actors are using, part of their broader sabotage operations, economic warfare, influence campaigns and espionage efforts and the like, all of which fall short of what's usually thought of as boundaries of war and armed conflict between nation states. So this is an increasingly important topic for businesses across sectors to be aware of, to be vigilant, to defend against, and where possible to build resilience, which is where Another Day comes in, as a Gallagher company and a specialist crisis and risk management consultancy. So that's enough from me. Let's get into it. Sneha, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we go any further, could you give a brief introduction to your role at Another Day?
So I'm a crisis and security strategy consultant. I mainly specialise in cybersecurity, but I also work on other areas of risk like climate adaptation, which I'm also very interested in. But primarily I work in cybersecurity risk, and I work with Gallagher clients to help them approach the market with the aim of getting cyber insurance. So I work with a lot of businesses who fundamentally don't understand what their cyber risk looks like, and it's sometimes that fact-finding mission that is so interesting.
I think with these intangible risks, and cyber is one of them, but our topic today is really how that relates to actually physical infrastructure. From an insured or a business perspective, whether it's cyber risk or whether it's something that approaches war or PVT, in a way it doesn't matter. It's all about protecting their business, isn't it? So this does feel like one of those areas where it's between the two.
Definitely. And I think it's one of those areas that you may not care so much about digital infrastructure, but digital infrastructure very much so cares about you as a business. And we are inherently reliant on this, whether or not we're a person using our phone or whether or not we're a business who has a huge enterprise IT infrastructure set up.
So is this a topic that is a recurring one for you? Does it crop up a lot in your role at Another Day?
It isn't one necessarily that crops up repeatedly outside of the business risk. However, it is something that I'm specifically interested in because I used to be a research fellow at RUSI, which is the Royal United Services Institute, and I used to be a cybersecurity research fellow there. So I've touched on these issues a lot, and I can now see the thread from the high level politics that's going on and diplomacy and fight for global influence, and how that then threads through to the private sector and businesses and how they manage risk.
So when I was doing a bit of background reading for this topic, it's obvious just from a cursory Google just how much activity there is. There were 3 stories that I picked out actually just from the last month or so. So the first one cited a UK example of a hack at the Ministry of Defence, and this was a story published in August. I think the hack was in May, but basically citing a report from Thales, the defence firm, saying that 93% of organisations in the critical national infrastructure, CNI sector, have observed an increase in cyber attacks, and 42% of critical infrastructure organisations had suffered a data breach. The second example, also from August, was US government agencies issued a cybersecurity advisory alerting critical infrastructure organisations about cyber actors connected with the government of Iran, targeting and exploiting organisations in the education, finance, healthcare and defence sectors, as well as local government entities in the US, Israel, Azerbaijan and the UAE. So the third example was from Czechia. So strategic Czech institutions saw 4 hostile intrusions or attempted attacks into their cyber systems last year. And that was an annual report from the National Agency for Cyber and Information Security from the Czech Republic. That was focused on Russian and Chinese hackers who attempted to obtain sensitive government information. For security reasons, the report does not specify which institutions were targeted, but instead describes general trends in cybersecurity. So there's a lot going on in this space. But before we go any further, let's try and define it. Let's try and draw a box around it. So what do we mean by digital infrastructure?
Infrastructure can be quite a broad term these days, because it relates to everything that we're physically reliant on, like water, electricity, and so forth. So it's a big bucket. But as we've evolved into digitally native people, infrastructure has had to keep up. And infrastructure on land, like data centers, masts, cables, internet terminals, they're constantly evolving as new generations of technology emerge. And in the sea, we have deep sea cables that form a critical part of the internet backbone. So it's a very complex set of infrastructure that's critical to the ongoing use of the internet. And that also means it's then a target of state-sponsored cyber attacks or non-state threat actors.
Subsea cables crisscross the world's oceans. These pipelines on the seafloor, where they're transmitting oil or gas or telecoms data, are vital, but they're also very vulnerable. Attention in the past 2 years has focused on the Baltic Sea, allegations of Russian sabotage of cables since European countries sent military aid to Ukraine. Germany in particular drastically reduced its reliance on Russian energy, and Sweden and Finland joined the NATO defensive alliance. Almost exactly a year ago, an undersea telecoms cable connecting Estonia and Sweden was damaged, the Swedish government revealed, and around the same time, an undersea gas pipeline connecting Finland and Estonia was also damaged. And of course, in September 2022, a number of explosions occurred on the Nord Stream gas pipelines under the Baltic that had been used to transport Russian gas to Germany. Denmark, Germany and Sweden each initiated separate investigations describing the explosions as sabotage, but of course attribution has been hard to prove.
Absolutely. It's such a critical part of infrastructure that we're never going to fully know what the results are of investigations like that because it's so sensitive. The idea that a deep sea cable could get compromised, for example, is a very sensitive piece of information because you don't want your own citizens and businesses in particular to know that that's been compromised.
Yeah.
You want to be able to fix it and get on with day to day.
The threat that we're talking about today, so this is a state-sponsored threat, right?
Yeah.
It is what you'd call grey zone activity?
So grey zone activity are typically actions that fall below the threshold of military action or armed conflict. So this would include cyber attacks, which are seen as hostile, but fall below that threshold. And generally this is tested to be true because we haven't seen cyber become a significant differentiator in conflict yet. And that's not to say that people aren't keen for it to be seen as such, like we saw with the attack on Hezbollah with those pages. There are lots of people jumping very quickly to say this is a cyber attack when that just isn't the case and that was a piece of misinformation. If it was, we'd be starting to reconfigure what we understand by grey zone activity because for the time being, cyber is an excellent tool of espionage, subterfuge, disruption, but falling under that threshold of military conflict.
I'm constantly thinking with an insurance hat on, this would be within that grey zone as well, where it could be excluded as cyber war. Even though, as you say, from a kind of non-insurance perspective, these are things that, from a government perspective, fall short of war. But I think this is one area where the insurance market takes a different view. It's very keen to label them as cyber war.
Precisely. And I've heard from other brokers as well that at this point in history, there hasn't yet been a call for overwriting a policy based on war exclusions. But that's not to say that that won't happen in the future. And I think it's a very complex conversation to be had, both in line with the government as well.
So as we've already said, these risks are linked together so closely, interrelatedly. So the physical and the intangible stuff. Is there a risk of organisations seeing cyber risk in isolation from physical infrastructure?
I think organisations, especially large ones, are not prone to view cyber risk in isolation from physical infrastructure because things like tailgating are a real risk and IT teams have to make sure that employees are aware of this. So they're dealing with it on a day-to-day basis of where that intangible and physical merge. But on a more macro scale, digital infrastructure forms part of the supply chain of organisations and people. You know, we're still reliant on the internet backbone for connectivity, but the backbone is made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of different organisations and businesses that cobble together to provide services. Take AWS, for example. Their cloud infrastructure is now a critical component of the supply chain for many businesses. How AWS manages their physical and cyber risk is critical to the ongoing function of many organisations. Even with the amount of redundancy that they put in place, that mechanism of redundancy is crucial that they have that. For businesses, I guess one of the key areas that insurance is really interested in is how you're managing your supply chain, because very often it's supply chain cyber attacks that then cause an issue down the line. We saw this with the NHS literally a few months ago with Synovis, and the ongoing impacts of that were very physical. There were people without healthcare. So that's a very serious issue. The supply chain does make a huge component of that. Obviously, Synovis on a digital infrastructure supplier, they were a blood supplier. So it's a slightly different understanding of what that supply is. However, when you're choosing what your technology stack looks like, one of the questions you have to really pick apart is, what does redundancy look like if this critical system goes down? Am I able to carry on a day-to-day basis if I lose connectivity to XYZ system?
Okay, so let's move on to look at things like motives, but capabilities and impact of these types of risks or events when they happen. So to start with, what are the most common motivations, do you think, of the threat actors that we're talking about here?
I think if we're talking about states in particular, which is what we fundamentally, I think, care about when we talk about digital infrastructure attacks, the classic motivations of state fall under the similar buckets that we've seen: espionage, disruption, financial gain in some respects. You know, we can't deny the fact that there is some level of financial desire, and subterfuge. That's typically what determines what the impact of a cyber attack is going to be, is what the motivation that drives that. And we've seen a lot of examples of that over the years, of those different motivations and how they're played out. The thing we are still grappling with is when state actors use proxy actors, and when we're not sure when something is a proxy actor or state-sponsored or non-state. I still think there's quite a lot of work to be done there.
Yes.
With understanding.
If you
that.
can't attribute, it's difficult to attribute motive.
Very difficult. And it's very long to attribute, you know.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to attribute an attack.
And there's also a bit of what the Russians call maskirovka, a bit of deliberate misleading sometimes. I remember when NotPetya happened, and it was a ransomware attack on face value, but they weren't interested in collecting ransoms. It was actually just about taking down systems and causing disruption. But there's that misleading about what the motive is, potentially can increase the effect of the attack, I guess.
It can often obfuscate from the bottom line, which is that you need to focus on your cyber defense if you're a business. What the motivation of an attack may be X or Y or Z, but if you're investing heavily in your cyber defenses, it almost, dare I say, it doesn't matter. It matters much more what your defensive posture looks like.
So corporate espionage, you just touched on it, but it's something that seems pretty pervasive to me. It's a bit of an awkward reality for firms to confront, I think, in some jurisdictions, because they don't want to confront the reality of this. The politics is tricky. Do you think that the level of espionage activity has been underestimated?
I think it's a good question, because fundamentally, I think specifically corporate espionage is not currently well understood from a threat perspective and is likely to be underestimated. I'm sure many businesses would be horrified at the idea of doing anything remotely akin to corporate espionage, but it would also be quite naive to believe that some don't, especially if there isn't a strong sense of law and order in certain jurisdictions, as you mentioned. We also have third-party providers of spyware who would profit from corporate espionage. So from a research perspective, it would be very interesting to understand what corporate espionage is and how it operates. But if we're talking practically here for cyber defense, again, it's less significant to understand who's trying to conduct corporate espionage against you as it is ensuring your defensive posture can handle it.
I mean, this is very sensitive data in a lot of cases, but it's just a question of keeping these questions in mind of, you know, who laid the cables and Where are you operating and who might stand to benefit?
I think it's totally dependent on the organisation you are. Obviously, if you are an intragovernmental organisation like the African Union, it really matters who laid the cables, who's managing your IT stack. If you're a business that works in critical infrastructure and handles very sensitive data, again, you really need to understand who's managing your IT stack. At the same time, if you're a retailer, it's less important. There's very little sensitive data there that you couldn't just recoup in the future. So it really is dependent.
Let's move on to the sort of capabilities. So what are some of the cyber capabilities that we're talking about here through infiltrating infrastructure?
The way I see it, there's a kind of a two-pronged approach to this. The first is a straight-up cyber attack on any kind of infrastructure. It's malware-driven and there's a clear end goal of the attack. The second approach, which in the last decade has grown in prominence as an issue for Western nations, are actors who provide the digital infrastructure, using it for espionage purposes, allegedly, and gain an advantage or leverage over a nation.
So let's move on to look at some of the consequences. So what can be some of the more common or the more severe consequences for organizations that will wind up as the victims of attacks, whether it's espionage or theft of data or whatever it is?
I deal very heavily on a day-to-day basis with concern about financial impact. So that's obviously front and center if you're a business. And that's highly dependent on what the kinds of disaster response procedures are in place, which third parties you're relying on to help respond to the incident, and whether you have insurance in place. The second impact, I think, that has been underestimated is the psychological impact this can have on an organisation. And we don't talk about it enough. It's upper management, and crucially, it's your information security team that you want to make sure the psychological impact of a breach is actually having a more positive outcome than negative outcome. Obviously, being breached is always going to feel negative, but from a psychological point of view, it will test your culture. It will test how well you work together. Blame games and things like that do come out of the back of cyber incidents leave a lasting impact on organizations, and that is toxic.
Okay, so let's move on to what I would term a battle for influence. So for emerging markets, particularly global south economies, is this topic of critical national infrastructure, cyber within infrastructure, a big diplomatic battleground for influence in the 21st century?
I think it is. I mean, building digital infrastructure, supporting the next generation of technology development is a major battleground for influence and players like the US and China, who all have a vested interest in competing and winning these battles. And the global south is increasingly growing in prominence economically, technologically, and socially. And so building these inroads diplomatically with countries in the global south is crucial. And digital infrastructure is one way to do that. And we've seen the US build this idea and response to China with the Lobito corridor, which is how they coined the first strategic economic corridor, which is a multilateral plan to connect the DRC and Zambia to European and North American markets via the port in Angola that's called Lobito. And that's in direct competition with China, who provided more than $170 billion to African countries and regional organizations from 2000 through to 2022.
This isn't just the physical port infrastructure or building roads, it's cyber infrastructure too.
So the strategic economic corridor is really interested in all sorts of bits of infrastructure, including digital. But it's also a concept, right? In the same way that the Belt and Road Initiative was a concept. The thing is, purchasing power matters here, and how you compete with purchasing power between the US and China. It's on a different scale, and we're seeing the outcomes of that.
But this is still in play though, right? I mean, there's parts of Africa where it does feel like Chinese influence is very strong. In other aspects of influence through paramilitary mercenary groups like Wagner, Russia also exerts influence in parts of Africa and West Africa, for example, as well. But depending on where you look around the globe, this is still very much in play, this battle for influence.
Yes, absolutely. The DRC, for example, China has a huge vested interest in the DRC because, the things like cobalt, cadmium, copper, those types of raw materials that are very rich in the Katanga region in the DRC are critical to technology and alloys. things like the Seco Mines consortium of Chinese companies that kind of banded together and worked with the Congolese government in 2008 to grant mineral concessions in exchange for infrastructure investments. So it was a very kind of cross-party deal in that sense. And originally it was worth $9 billion US dollars and funded by a Chinese bank. And that 6 billion of that would go towards infrastructure and 3 billion into mining operations. But 68% of the operation would be owned by the Chinese consortium. So it was majority held. And in return for this, China gains an ally. In July 2019, UN ambassadors of 37 countries, including the DRC, signed a joint letter to the UNHRC defending China's treatment of the Uyghurs. So it's really, really fundamental to that diplomatic relationship, what the kind of deals look like, what the infrastructure exchange looks like. And that is crucial, to be honest. Luckily, I think the DRC is starting to bounce back from this. In 2017, there was a report that estimated that $685 million in loans for the Seco Mines infrastructure projects had gone missing, and there was no evidence that the money was used for its intended purpose. So there is a question there about what these deals look like and what the response should be from the West.
Well, let's look at another area too. So again, we're looking at Chinese influence. In the Pacific, undersea cables are more of a maritime example, but you've got Pacific Islands that are, again, it's part of that broader diplomatic great game stuff, isn't it? Where you've got the Chinese trying to essentially sew up relationships, but they're also laying the cables and doing the physical infrastructure.
Massively so. I mean, the South Pacific Islands are a huge area of competition between China and Australia. Obviously, the West kind of coalescing around Australia. That's a battleground for influence. And connecting islands through deep sea cables is one way that's playing out. In late 2023, the US and Australia announced plans for Google and Microsoft to build the new Trans-Pacific cables as part of the South Pacific Connect initiative. And that was in direct competition with Huawei for that. And it turned out that Australia became the partner of choice as it worked very closely with the Fijian government to emphasize how they value transparency, they value retaining Fijian culture, they don't want to build a cultural initiative as well as an infrastructure one. Whereas I think we've seen over the last couple of decades, China decide that it quite likes the cultural export that it provides as well as the infrastructure. So it is a very dynamic situation where you're seeing these power plays happen.
So that's an example of Australia and the US and the West doing quite well in that battle of influence, for the Fijian example. But there have been other ones where I think where the Chinese have got the better of the West. I'm thinking of the Solomon Islands.
I think, like I mentioned before, it does come down to purchasing power. Money is very attractive for nations that potentially need it or are in dire straits of needing it. And so it's very well documented that China will provide money under loans, and then that's their level of leverage that they have whilst also providing infrastructure.
Okay, so how do we go about capacity building, resilience building within some of these countries? And have we already been doing this?
Within many global South countries, the UK, US allies all invest in capacity building to various degrees. And I worked towards understanding what capacity building could be effective in different regions when I was working at RUSI. And building cyber capacity should always be specifically about making the country digitally safer, whilst also protecting the values that we hold dear, like free speech. This is especially hard to reconcile with countries who don't see that line nearly as clearly as we do. So the question is, what capacity building is most impactful, of which there are many options, from incident response exercises, supporting risk management for their governments or their private sector where there aren't as many cybersecurity firms, training in digital forensics. But from the hard physical infrastructure side, unfortunately, that's just a very expensive mission of providing digital infrastructure. But as we've seen with Australia and Fiji, it is possible for us to to partner with private sector, like Microsoft, like the Googles of the world, to help build that in those regions. And I think that's a crucial way of democratically doing it and transparently doing it with countries of the global south, whilst also respecting them and their cultures.
So let's focus on your risk management role of supporting clients in this way. So this does feel like one of those topics where, as an organization, even as a mid-sized corporate organization, you can just feel at the mercy of the bigger geopolitical currents going on in the world. But are there things they can do? What are the pieces of advice, however specific or broad, that you'd want to check that organizations can think of to do?
From a cyber perspective, it's really about shoring up your own position, building a good cyber risk management practice and culture, and trying to unpack what supply chain dependency looks like is really critical, because having redundancies and trying to build stability into the operating model are going to be the best way of weathering those storms. So that's kind of the piece of advice that I would give from a high level, which is have that understanding, start at ground zero of what do I have? What am I using these systems for? Are they critical? Do I need to make sure that I have redundancies in place for these things? Because when the storm comes, I'm not going to have time to decide which redundancy to use. I just need to have a plan to do it.
So same question, but particularly for corporate espionage, because that just seems like such a major threat. Is there some specific risk management or cybersecurity guidance out there that you could particularly recommend for that?
Defending against espionage is really baked into the vast amount of controls you'd have in place to defend against other threats. But having things like good behavioural analysis for monitoring tools will help in understanding if there's insider threat, and using vendors that are trying to build defensive capabilities at the cutting edge, such as automation and machine learning and so forth, is very helpful in trying to reduce the load that you put on your IT teams to manage those kind of very tricky behavioural questions, because espionage is quite dependent on insider threat at times, but insider threat can be both passive and active, right? You can be an active participant to wanting to leak information, or you can be a passive one that accidentally does it. And so that's where it's really critical that we understand the behavioural science behind our defences and how to make sure that they're in place.
Well, no conversation is complete without talking about AI. So artificial intelligence, as if I need to spell it out. So AI is a bit of a double-edged sword in the hand of bad actors, but also used in the hands of security professionals, quite a powerful tool, I imagine. So, yeah, how can AI help on this topic? Can it be an enabler for the defence?
Absolutely. And as I mentioned around machine learning and automation being a key part of that defensive posture, AI can be a real differentiator in the cybersecurity risk management field. We've actually, as a team, recently published an AI white paper, and in that, myself and my colleague, who's also a cyber consultant, Nick Robinson, go into some ways that AI is shaping offensive and defensive cyber capability. Offensively, we've not seen the full capability in the wild for major automated attacks, but from a defensive point of view, vendors are really starting to make use of AI and bake it into their products, and automating monitoring and vulnerability scanning that can, once again, like I mentioned, alleviate that pressure on information security teams that probably argue with me that potentially it's more effort to manage these systems, but really there is that back office function that AI can trawl through much quicker than a human can.
Well, let's move on to your involvement when you're talking with clients. When your insurance broking colleagues refer you to speak with a client, if that's the way it works, I'm guessing typically a mid-sized firm, how does that process tend to unfold?
We typically open up the conversation around how we can help assist them in cyber insurance placement. However, sometimes that conversation might start differently, with us talking about what areas they're most concerned about or what needs they have to build a better understanding of their risk posture. We'll then explain that we have a position as an almost proxy underwriter, whereby we give them a comprehensive picture of their risk and provide financial analysis of their exposure. On the other hand, we get approached to run cyber incident response exercises because a client may want to drill a specific process or test their management team's cohesiveness in responding to a cyber incident.
For an incident response exercise, what's involved?
First off, we build an understanding of the network, processes, and systems that an organisation relies on and build a mock incident off the back of that. We then spend a day in a workshop mode with the client to drill that exercise and document the mechanics of how they communicate with their teams and what trigger points they may respond to. And we may also pull in third-party PR and legal teams if that's what the client uses or wants. We'll kind of adapt to that situation. And at the end of that, we provide advisory on what the next steps are at enhancing that crisis management team and that critical response.
You already mentioned the phrase proxy underwriter, which I think is a great one or an interesting one. So you're evaluating the risk much like an underwriter would, but preemptively, so you can improve it.
Yes, precisely. And our aim is to really focus on understanding how a client's risk posture is going to impact them in the event of an incident. Because at the end of the day, that's where you're really tested and where you're going to need that insurer's backing to help you financially and operationally get through that incident. I mean, that's one thing that I think we underestimate about cyber insurance is when the incident does happen, the amount of support that you get from the insurers and the resource that's available is very significant and can move the dial significantly in terms of, like I mentioned before, coming out of that incident with a positive experience, even though it was a very negative thing to happen. Inevitably, there's always the chance of it happening. So we have to make sure we're prepared.
Thanks for listening to this special episode in association with Gallagher Specialty. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Sneha Dowda, at Another Day. Please tune in next time when we'll be back with another episode soon. This podcast was produced by Peter McGill and Lawrence Durkin made the music.